When the ones who have always protected us suddenly refuse to move forward, it is worth asking what they hear that we do not. The first snowfall of November had dusted the Colorado foothills in a thin veil of white by the time Jack Sullivan and Ranger reached the old mining trail beyond Cedar Ridge. The 47-year-old veteran had walked this path dozens of times since settling into the quiet rhythms of mountain life, finding comfort in the crunch of gravel beneath his boots and the steady companionship of the German shepherd at his side. Ranger usually moved with calm confidence, trotting several steps ahead before pausing to glance back, as if making certain Jack was keeping pace. It had become their unspoken ritual, one that asked for nothing and offered everything. The morning air carried the scent of pine sap and cold stone, while distant peaks disappeared behind low clouds gathering above the valley. Jack adjusted the collar of his worn denim jacket and pulled his knit cap lower over his ears. Retirement had never looked the way he imagined it during long nights overseas. He had traded military schedules for chopped firewood, quiet coffee on the porch, and the company of a dog whose loyalty asked no questions about the burdens he still carried. Ranger suddenly stopped. Jack nearly stumbled before noticing the German shepherd standing perfectly still in the center of the trail. His ears stood rigid. Amber eyes focused ahead. The thick black and tan fur along his neck seemed to tighten beneath the winter breeze. "What is it, buddy?" Jack asked softly. Ranger did not look back. 50 yards ahead, partially hidden by overgrown brush and decades of neglect, the entrance to the old Silver Hollow tunnel emerged from the mountainside like an open wound carved into stone. Jack remembered hearing stories about it from locals at the diner in town. The railway tunnel had once connected mining operations deep beneath the mountain before being abandoned sometime in the early 1970s. Most people avoided it now, dismissing it as another forgotten piece of Colorado history. Ranger had passed abandoned structures before without hesitation. He had explored old barns, ranger stations, and weather-beaten cabins with curious confidence. But this time was different. The German shepherd lowered his body slightly and planted his paws firmly against the frozen earth. Jack called his name again. Ranger glanced toward him at last, and what unsettled Jack most was not fear. It was certainty. The dog refused to take another step. Jack approached carefully until he stood beside Ranger facing the tunnel entrance. Rust stained the old steel supports framing the opening. Icicles hung from jagged rock edges while shadows swallowed the interior beyond the reach of daylight. The silence felt unusually heavy. Then it happened. A metallic sound drifted outward from deep within the darkness. Clang. Jack froze. Several seconds passed. Clang. It echoed again, distant yet distinct, as though metal wheels had brushed forgotten tracks somewhere beneath the mountain. He looked down at Ranger. The German shepherd remained motionless, eyes fixed ahead, breath rising in steady clouds against the cold air. Jack listened carefully, forcing himself to search for a practical explanation. Shifting rocks, whined through rusted supports, water striking loose metal. Yet the sound returned once more with impossible rhythm. Clang, clang, like footsteps remembered by steel long after the people who made them had disappeared. Ranger stepped backward for the first time since Jack had known him. The veteran's pulse quickened beneath layers of flannel and denim as he stared into the tunnel's silent mouth. Somewhere inside that forgotten darkness, something had found its voice again. Jack Sullivan stood motionless at the mouth of Silver Hollow Tunnel while the metallic echo faded once more into the mountain's ancient silence. Frost clung to the edges of his boots, and his breath drifted upward in pale clouds beneath the steel-gray sky. Ranger remained beside him, muscles taut beneath his black and tan coat, amber eyes fixed upon the darkness ahead with unwavering intensity. The German shepherd had faced thunderstorms without flinching, navigated unfamiliar wilderness trails without hesitation, and accompanied Jack through countless quiet routines since entering his life. Yet now, for reasons Jack could neither understand nor explain, Ranger refused to take another step toward the tunnel. Jack crouched beside him and placed a gloved hand gently against the dog's shoulder. "It is all right," he murmured softly. "We are not going anywhere you do not want to go." Ranger's ears flicked slightly at the familiar sound of Jack's voice, but his gaze never left the tunnel entrance. The veteran straightened and listened carefully. Nothing. Only wind threading through pine branches above and the distant cry of a hawk circling beyond the ridge. The metallic sound had stopped entirely. Logic insisted there had to be an explanation. Old tunnels shifted. Moisture dripped through forgotten supports. Loose debris could settle unpredictably beneath decades of neglect. Jack had learned long ago that fear often rushed to occupy spaces left open by uncertainty. He glanced back toward the trail winding through the snow-dusted forest and considered leaving. The sensible choice would be returning home, brewing another pot of coffee, and dismissing the entire encounter as a curious mountain oddity. Yet something beneath the surface of reason held him rooted in place. Perhaps it was the look in Ranger's eyes. Not panic, not confusion, recognition, as though the dog had encountered something familiar hidden within the silence of stone. Jack reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved his flashlight. He directed the beam toward the tunnel's interior without crossing the threshold. Rusted tracks stretched forward before disappearing beneath shadows untouched by daylight. Water glistened along sections of rock walls, and old support beams leaned beneath the weight of passing years. Everything appeared abandoned exactly as it should. Then the sound returned. Clang. Jack's pulse stumbled. The flashlight trembled slightly in his hand as the metallic echo rolled through the tunnel. Clang. It arrived again after a measured pause. Not random, not chaotic, deliberate. Ranger immediately stepped backward, pressing closer against Jack's leg. The German shepherd released a low breath through his nose and lifted his head toward the darkness as if listening beyond ordinary hearing. Jack switched off the flashlight. The silence that followed felt heavier without artificial light cutting through it. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing the mountain to speak in its own language. Pine branches whispered overhead. Snow shifted softly from distant limbs. Then, impossibly, the metallic rhythm sounded again. Clang, clang. Jack opened his eyes. "Do you hear that?" he asked, though there was nobody present to answer except the dog beside him. Ranger turned away from the tunnel at last and began walking back toward the trail. After several steps, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. Waiting. Inviting. Jack hesitated before following. The journey back through the forest unfolded beneath gathering clouds and fading afternoon light. Neither man nor dog glanced toward Silver Hollow again until they reached the overlook above Cedar Ridge. Only then did Jack look back across the valley. The mountain stood silent beneath fresh snow, ancient and unmoved by human questions. He slipped the flashlight back into his jacket and scratched gently behind Ranger's ears. "Maybe somebody in town knows what that sound was," he said quietly. Ranger leaned briefly against his knee before continuing down the trail. As twilight settled across the foothills and porch lights flickered awake in the valley below, Jack could not shake the unsettling realization settling within him. He had heard the metallic echo clearly. Ranger had reacted before it arrived. And somewhere beyond the warmth of home and the comfort of ordinary explanations, the mountain had just asked them both to remember something everyone else had forgotten. Some photographs preserve memories. Others wait patiently for someone brave enough to understand what they were trying to say. By the time Jack Sullivan pulled his aging pickup truck into Cedar Ridge the following morning, the mountains had disappeared behind low clouds heavy with approaching snow. Ranger occupied his usual place in the passenger seat, though the German shepherd seemed unusually attentive, lifting his head each time the road curved toward the northern slopes where Silver Hollow Tunnel lay hidden. Beneath stone and pine, Jack had slept poorly. Each time he closed his eyes, the metallic rhythm returned with impossible clarity. Clang. Pause. Clang. Not chaotic. Not threatening. Deliberate. The local diner had begun filling with ranchers, retirees, and early risers seeking warmth beneath fluorescent lights and the comfort of familiar conversation. Jack recognized several faces from previous visits and ordered black coffee before settling into a booth near the window. Ranger rested quietly beside him. "You look like a man carrying more questions than answers," came a voice from nearby. Jack looked up to find Harold Bishop lowering himself carefully into the opposite seat. The retired railroad mechanic had spent nearly 40 years working freight lines throughout Colorado and possessed the sort of memory that transformed local history into living conversation. Jack hesitated before describing the sound he had heard near Silver Hollow. He expected Harold to dismiss it with practical explanations. Instead, The older man's weathered expression tightened. You said it came in pairs? Harold asked softly. Jack nodded. Harold stared into his untouched coffee. That tunnel closed after an accident back in 1971, he finally replied. Most folks stopped talking about it because nobody knew what to say afterward. Before Jack could ask another question, Harold pushed himself upright. If you really want answers, go see Evelyn Price at the Cedar Ridge Historical Society. The remainder of the morning unfolded beneath steady snowfall as Jack and Ranger entered the small brick building housing the town's archived memories. Dusty shelves lined narrow aisles while framed photographs documented generations of mountain life. Evelyn Price greeted them warmly before pausing to scratch behind Ranger's ears. The German shepherd accepted the gesture politely before wandering toward a display case near the rear of the room. His movement stopped abruptly. Ranger lowered his head and stared at an old black-and-white photograph resting beneath glass. Jack stepped closer. The image showed a group of miners and railway workers gathered outside Silver Hollow decades earlier. Most smiled toward the camera beneath soot-stained caps and heavy coats. Yet one figure drew Jack's attention immediately. A teenage boy stood near the edge of the group, no older than 14. He wore an oversized jacket and held a small metal lantern against his chest. Someone had written his name neatly beneath the photograph. Benjamin Carter. Ranger released a quiet breath and nudged the edge of the display case with his nose. Evelyn noticed the reaction and adjusted her glasses. Benjamin disappeared during the tunnel closure, she explained softly. The official report said nobody knew exactly what happened. Jack leaned closer. Something had been taped to the back of the framed photograph, partially hidden beneath aged paper. With Evelyn's permission, the frame was carefully opened. Folded inside rested a yellowed newspaper clipping and a handwritten note. The article described the disappearance of Benjamin Carter alongside a rescue supervisor named Thomas Whitaker. The handwritten message contained only a single sentence penned in fading blue ink. He kept hearing the sound and said someone was still down there. Jack felt a chill unrelated to the winter weather gathering outside. Ranger sat perfectly still beside him, amber eyes fixed upon the photograph of the missing boy. Snow drifted silently against the Historical Society windows, while distant church bells marked the passing hour. Jack looked down at the German shepherd before returning his gaze to Benjamin's young face, preserved in monochrome memory. Somewhere between forgotten records and echoes trapped beneath stone, Silver Hollow had begun offering its first real answers. And judging by the way Ranger refused to look away from that photograph, the mountain had not finished speaking yet. By the time Jack Sullivan and Ranger returned to Silver Hollow the following afternoon, fresh snow had softened the jagged edges of the mountainside and transformed the surrounding forest into a landscape wrapped in muted silence. Gray clouds drifted low above the pines while the cold carried the familiar scent of stone, cedar, and distant snowfall. Jack parked his pickup near the old trailhead and remained seated for several moments, his gloved hands resting on the steering wheel as he replayed the words written beneath Benjamin Carter's photograph. He kept hearing the sound and said someone was still down there. Ranger shifted beside the passenger door, his amber eyes attentive but calm. Unlike the previous day, the German shepherd showed no reluctance to approach the trail itself. His hesitation seemed reserved only for whatever waited beneath the mountain. The walk toward the tunnel unfolded beneath the steady crunch of snow beneath boots and paws. Wind stirred through the towering pines, carrying with it the occasional release of powder drifting from high branches. Jack noticed how Ranger paused more frequently than usual, lifting his head to test the air before continuing. There was no panic in the dog's movements, only purpose. When Silver Hollow emerged once more from the mountainside, its rusted steel supports dusted white against dark stone, Ranger stopped exactly where he had before. The German shepherd planted himself firmly and stared toward the tunnel entrance. Jack crouched beside him and removed the folded newspaper clipping from his jacket pocket. Benjamin Carter's youthful face looked back at him from beneath fading print. 14 years old, missing for more than 5 decades. Beside the clipping rested a hand-drawn map Evelyn Price had discovered among archived documents after Jack's visit. According to official records, Silver Hollow contained only a single tunnel extending roughly half a mile before ending near collapsed sections. Yet the rough sketch revealed something omitted from later surveys. a maintenance passage branching away from the main line. Jack studied the map carefully before directing his flashlight toward the tunnel entrance once again. The beam illuminated rusted rails disappearing into shadow. Icicles clung to cracked support beams, while frozen water traced pale lines down the rock walls. Everything appeared abandoned. Then the sound returned. Clang. Ranger stiffened immediately. Clang. The metallic rhythm echoed outward with measured consistency. Jack glanced toward the map. The timing felt intentional, almost like a signal repeating across distance. This time, however, something changed. Ranger stepped sideways rather than backward. The German shepherd lowered his nose toward the outer rock wall beside the tunnel entrance and began moving slowly along its surface. Jack followed. Several yards from the opening, Ranger stopped beside a section of stone partially concealed beneath thick brush and years of accumulated debris. Snow clung to twisted roots emerging through narrow cracks in the rock face. Ranger pawed lightly at the ground before looking directly at Jack. The veteran brushed away snow and brittle vegetation with gloved hands until weathered timber emerged beneath the surface. He froze. Hidden behind decades of neglect rested the outline of a narrow wooden doorway built into the mountain itself. Smaller than the main tunnel. Easily overlooked. Jack's pulse quickened beneath his heavy coat as he traced the edge of the concealed frame. According to official reports, no such entrance existed. Ranger remained perfectly still beside him, ears raised toward the mountain while the metallic sound echoed once again through stone and silence. Clang, clang. Jack rested one hand against the hidden doorway, feeling the rough grain beneath his fingertips. Beyond it lay a passage forgotten by maps, records, and memory itself. Snow drifted softly around them as daylight faded behind gathering clouds. Ranger met Jack's gaze without fear, as though asking a simple question neither of them could ignore any longer. If the mountain had gone to such lengths to hide this place, what truth had waited all these years for someone willing to listen closely enough to find it? Jack Sullivan remained kneeling beside the hidden wooden doorway while snow drifted quietly through the pines above Silver Hollow. His gloved fingers traced the weathered grain buried beneath decades of brush and frozen earth. Ranger stood at his shoulder, the German shepherd's ears raised toward the mountainside, while his steady breathing formed pale clouds in the fading afternoon light. The metallic rhythm echoed once more through stone and silence. Clang, clang. It no longer sounded threatening. Instead, it carried an almost sorrowful persistence, like someone knocking gently against the door of memory itself. Jack studied the narrow entrance concealed within the rock face. The rough map discovered at the Historical Society had hinted at an overlooked maintenance route, but official records had omitted any mention of a secondary access point. He brushed away additional snow and discovered an iron handle rusted with age, yet surprisingly intact. Easy, he murmured softly, more to reassure himself than the dog beside him. Ranger shifted closer, but did not retreat. The veteran pulled carefully against the handle. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a reluctant groan softened by years of neglect, the hidden door yielded inward several inches. A breath of cool, dry air escaped from the darkness beyond. Jack raised his flashlight and directed the beam through the opening. A narrow stone passage extended into the mountainside. Unlike the larger railway tunnel, this corridor appeared deliberate and orderly. Wooden supports lined sections of the walls. The floor remained relatively level beneath a thin layer of dust untouched by recent footsteps. Ranger lowered his head and studied the threshold carefully. The German shepherd hesitated for several long moments before taking a single cautious step inside. Jack noticed the difference immediately. The fear that had held Ranger motionless outside Silver Hollow itself seemed absent here. Alertness remained, but something else had replaced resistance. Trust. Together they moved deeper into the concealed passage while flashlight beams danced across aged timber and mineral-streaked stone. The metallic sound did not return. Instead, silence enveloped them with unexpected gentleness. After approximately 50 yards, the corridor widened into a small chamber built into the mountain. Jack stopped abruptly. The room before him did not resemble the chaotic remnants of disaster. It looked preserved by intention. Folded wool blankets rested neatly upon wooden shelves. Empty food tins had been stacked carefully against one wall. A lantern sat upon a small table beside enamel cups arranged with quiet dignity. Someone had tried to create comfort. Here, Ranger moved slowly through the chamber before stopping beside a cedar chest positioned beneath a ventilation shaft where pale daylight filtered through narrow cracks above. The German shepherd looked back toward Jack and lowered himself beside the chest. Jack knelt and lifted the weathered lid. Inside, wrapped carefully within a faded canvas cloth, rested a leather-bound journal, several folded letters tied with twine, and a pocket watch whose silver casing had dulled with time. Jack lifted the journal with trembling hands. Pressed into the worn cover were initials. T.W. He swallowed hard before opening the first page. The handwriting appeared neat and steady. Thomas Whitaker, the rescue supervisor whose name had lived for decades beneath suspicion and unanswered questions. Early entries described routine inspections and ordinary responsibilities within Silver Hollow. Yet as Jack turned each fragile page, the tone shifted. Reports of unstable conditions gave way to concern for a frightened 14-year-old boy named Benjamin Carter. Thomas wrote of Benjamin's curiosity, his nervous attempts at bravery, and his habit of listening carefully whenever strange sounds echoed through the mountain. Then Jack reached an entry written in increasingly hurried script. If someone eventually finds these pages, please understand this truth. Benjamin was not abandoned. He heard the sound again and believed someone else remained trapped beyond the collapse. I could not send a frightened child into darkness alone. Ranger rested his head gently against Jack's shoulder while the veteran stared at the fading words before him. Outside, snow continued falling across Colorado's ancient ridges. Within the hidden chamber beneath Silver Hollow, the story people had carried for more than 50 years had begun to reveal its beating heart. Sometimes history forgets the quiet choices born from compassion. Sometimes ordinary courage becomes buried beneath fear and assumption. But somewhere between a faithful dog, an old journal, and the patient silence of stone, kindness had endured long enough to finally be remembered. Jack Sullivan remained seated on the floor of the hidden chamber. Long after he finished reading Thomas Whitaker's hurried confession, the leather-bound journal resting heavily across his lap, while Ranger settled quietly beside him beneath the thin shaft of winter daylight filtering through the mountain vent above. Outside, snow continued drifting across the Colorado foothills, muffling the world beyond Silver Hollow beneath layers of white silence. Inside the forgotten refuge carved into stone, time seemed to loosen its grip. The chamber no longer felt like an abandoned hiding place discovered by accident. It felt like a promise preserved against impossible odds. Ranger rested his head gently against Jack's knee, his steady warmth grounding the veteran against the tide of emotions rising unexpectedly within him. Jack had spent years learning how easily people became reduced to headlines and assumptions. A single report could redefine an entire life. A missing detail could shape decades of misunderstanding. Thomas Whitaker had entered Cedar Ridge history as the rescue supervisor who never returned from Silver Hollow. Benjamin Carter had become the curious teenager forever remembered through unanswered questions and fading photographs. Yet the journal resting before Jack told a different story. It described two frightened human beings navigating uncertainty together beneath the mountain rather than apart. Jack turned another fragile page. The handwriting steadied after the initial urgency, revealing entries written not by a man surrendering to despair, but by someone determined to preserve hope. Thomas described teaching Benjamin simple routines to quiet fear during long stretches of waiting. Card games sketched on scraps of paper, counting distant drips of water to mark passing hours. Sharing stories about fishing trips and baseball games beneath the glow of a lantern. One passage lingered longest in Jack's mind. Benjamin kept asking about the sound. He said it reminded him of someone trying to find their way home. I told him fear can make ordinary things seem larger than they are. But kindness often begins by listening before dismissing another person's truth. Jack paused and glanced toward Ranger. The German shepherd's amber eyes reflected the narrow beam of daylight above them. You listened, Jack whispered softly. Ranger shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against the veteran's side. The remaining journal entries revealed Thomas's growing concern for Benjamin's family waiting beyond the mountain. He wrote about a silver harmonica the boy carried in his jacket pocket and the dreams he shared of becoming an engineer one day. He worried that official reports might misunderstand their choices if circumstances prevented them from returning. Then Jack reached the final completed page. If these words survive longer than we do, let whoever finds them understand this. Benjamin was brave, not because he lacked fear, but because he continued searching for hope while afraid. If I am remembered at all, I hope people know that no child should face darkness believing they were abandoned. The handwriting ended there. No dramatic farewell. No explanation of what followed. Only compassion offered quietly through ink and paper. Jack closed the journal carefully while the mountain remained still around them. The metallic echo had not returned since entering the hidden chamber. Perhaps it never belonged to fear in the first place. Perhaps it had always been an invitation to listen more closely. Ranger suddenly lifted his head and turned toward the cedar chest. The German shepherd rose and nudged the folded letters resting beneath the journal. Jack unfolded the first envelope carefully. The handwriting differed from Thomas's steady script. Younger, less practiced. Dear Mom, if Mr. Whitaker ever gives you this letter, please tell Dad I am sorry I borrowed his flashlight without asking. Tell Emily I still owe her $5 from the county fair. And please do not worry too much. Mr. Whitaker says people are stronger together than they realize. Tears blurred Jack's vision as he lowered the page. Outside, the wind moved gently across snow-covered pines high above the mountain. Inside the chamber, beneath stone that had safeguarded forgotten truths for more than 50 years, a weary veteran and his faithful German shepherd discovered something far more enduring than mystery. They discovered the quiet evidence of ordinary people choosing tenderness when fear would have been easier. And somewhere beyond the remaining unopened letters waiting inside the cedar chest, another piece of Silver Hollow's unfinished story was still waiting to find its way home. The drive back to Cedar Ridge unfolded beneath a sky heavy with fresh snow, the cedar chest secured carefully in the rear of Jack Sullivan's pickup, while Ranger rested beside him in unusual silence. The veteran kept replaying the final words written by Thomas Whitaker and the unfinished letter Benjamin Carter had addressed to the family he never stopped loving. Beyond the windshield, the familiar mountain roads curved through forests softened by winter, while the hidden chamber beneath Silver Hollow lingered in Jack's thoughts like a heartbeat rediscovered after decades of quiet. Ranger occasionally lifted his head, amber eyes fixed toward the northern slopes before settling once again. Whatever had guided the German shepherd to the concealed doorway had not been fear alone. It had been purpose. By late afternoon, Jack parked outside the modest brick home identified in the historical records as belonging to Emily Carter Dawson. Benjamin's younger sister was now 70 years old. The house sat at the edge of Cedar Ridge beneath towering spruce trees decorated with snow. Wind chimes stirred gently beneath the front porch as Jack climbed the steps carrying the journal and carefully bundled letters. Ranger remained close at his side. Emily answered the door after a hesitant knock. Her silver hair framed a face marked not only by age but by the quiet endurance of unanswered questions. She greeted the unfamiliar veteran with polite caution until Jack spoke Benjamin's name. Something shifted instantly behind her eyes. She invited them inside without another word. The living room carried the warmth of a life carefully tended. Framed family photographs lined the mantel above a stone fireplace. Handmade quilts rested across worn furniture. Ranger settled respectfully near the doorway while Emily listened as Jack recounted the events unfolding since Silver Hollow called them back into its silence. He spoke gently of the hidden chamber, Thomas Whitaker's journal, and the letters preserved against time. When he placed Benjamin's folded note into her trembling hands, the room grew still. Emily adjusted her glasses before reading the familiar handwriting she had not seen since childhood. Dear Mom, if Mr. Whitaker ever gives you this letter, please tell Dad I am sorry I borrowed his flashlight without asking. Tell Emily I still owe her $5 from the county fair. Emily's breath caught softly as tears gathered along weathered lashes. A fragile smile appeared through sorrow. He always borrowed things without asking, she whispered. And he truly did owe me $5. She laughed quietly through tears that had waited more than 50 years for permission to fall. Ranger rose and approached carefully, resting his head beside Emily's hand. She stroked the German shepherd's fur with gentle fingers. I used to dream that Benjamin found someone kind enough not to leave him alone, she said. Jack opened Thomas Whitaker's journal and read aloud passages describing card games, shared stories, and efforts to calm a frightened boy beneath the mountain. Emily closed her eyes while listening. The years between loss and understanding seemed to narrow with every sentence. Outside, snow settled peacefully across Cedar Ridge while evening shadows stretched through the valley. Word traveled quickly through small towns. By nightfall, Harold Bishop, Evelyn Price, and several longtime residents had gathered quietly within Emily's living room. They listened as Jack shared the truth preserved inside forgotten pages. Expressions softened. Old assumptions unraveled. Thomas Whitaker, once remembered through uncertainty, emerged instead as a man who chose compassion over self-preservation. Benjamin Carter became more than a tragedy frozen in newspaper print. He became a son, a brother, and a boy who carried hope into darkness because someone stayed beside him. Ranger moved among them calmly, accepting grateful hands and whispered affection. No grand speeches followed. No dramatic declarations transformed the evening. Instead, ordinary people sat together beneath lamplight, sharing memories, long buried beneath discomfort and silence. Emily eventually retrieved a faded photograph from her bookshelf. Benjamin stood grinning beside a county fair game booth, while clutching a small stuffed bear beneath summer sunshine. She placed the picture beside Thomas's journal and looked toward Jack. "People deserve to be remembered by the love they gave," she said softly. Ranger settled near the fireplace while snow continued drifting outside the windows. In the quiet gathering of neighbors reclaiming forgotten truths, Jack understood something the mountain had been teaching them all along. Sometimes healing begins not with discovering what happened, but with finally choosing to tell the story correctly. The days that followed settled gently over Cedar Ridge beneath an endless procession of winter clouds, yet Silver Hollow refused to fade quietly into memory. The truth preserved within Thomas Whitaker's journal had begun reshaping conversations throughout town, but one question remained unanswered. What had caused the metallic echo that first drew Jack Sullivan and Ranger back toward the forgotten tunnel? Emily Carter Dawson had found peace within Benjamin's final words, and the community had begun restoring dignity to names long overshadowed by uncertainty. Even so, Jack found himself returning off into the mountain in thought. Ranger noticed it too. The German shepherd would lift his head whenever Jack stood near the farmhouse window facing north, ears alert as though listening for something carried beyond the reach of ordinary hearing. 3 mornings after gathering at Emily's home, Jack folded Thomas's journal carefully into his satchel and loaded the pickup once more. Ranger climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation. Snow still blanketed the foothills, though pale sunlight finally broke through the overcast sky as they traveled towards Silver Hollow. The mountain appeared less foreboding beneath the brightness of day. Familiar, patient. The trail leading toward the concealed passage bore the faint impressions of their previous visits. Jack walked steadily through the crisp air while Ranger moved beside him with quiet confidence. When the hidden doorway emerged once again from beneath the stone face of the mountain, the German shepherd did something Jack had not expected. Without pausing, Ranger crossed the threshold first. There was no resistance in his movements, no hesitation. His posture remained attentive, but the certainty that had once warned him away had softened into calm acceptance. Jack followed, flashlight in hand, though daylight filtering through narrow vents offered enough illumination to navigate the passage. The hidden chamber greeted them exactly as they had left it. Folded blankets rested neatly upon shelves. The cedar chest remained closed. Dust floated lazily through shafts of pale light. Jack stood quietly for several moments, allowing the stillness to settle around him. Then Ranger turned toward the far wall opposite the chamber entrance and lowered his head. The German shepherd approached slowly before stopping beside an old metal pipe protruding from the stone near the ceiling. He sat beside it and looked directly at Jack. Curious, Jack raised the flashlight and examined the rusted fixture more closely. The pipe extended upward through the rock, disappearing toward unseen ventilation shafts carved decades earlier into the mountain. He traced its length with the beam before noticing faint markings etched near its base. Maintenance airflow system. Jack's breath caught softly. He remained motionless as understanding settled over him with unexpected tenderness. During severe weather, Shifting pressure and mountain winds traveling through the abandoned ventilation network would create intermittent contact between loose metal components hidden throughout the old tunnel infrastructure. The resulting resonance echoed rhythmically through Silver Hollow's forgotten corridors. Clang. Pause. Clang. The sound that had haunted memory and rumor for more than 50 years had never been supernatural. It had been natural, yet its meaning had become extraordinary through the people willing to listen. Jack lowered himself beside Ranger and rested one hand against the German shepherd's shoulder. Tears gathered unexpectedly at the corners of his eyes. Benjamin had heard the same metallic rhythm all those years ago. Thomas had stayed because a frightened boy believed someone might still be lost within the mountain. Fear had invited compassion. Compassion had preserved humanity. Ranger leaned gently against Jack, while winter sunlight spilled across the chamber floor. At that exact moment, wind shifted beyond the mountain. The old pipe trembled softly overhead. Clang. The familiar sound drifted through stone one final time. Neither Jack nor Ranger flinched. There was no fear left inside it now, only understanding. Jack closed his eyes and listened as the echo faded naturally into silence. Somewhere above them, snow melted from pine branches beneath the warmth of afternoon light. Somewhere behind them, an entire town had begun telling its history differently. And deep within Silver Hollow, what once sounded like a warning had revealed itself instead as an invitation to choose kindness before judgment, presence before assumption, and love before fear. Winter gradually loosened its hold on Cedar Ridge in the weeks that followed, and the mountains surrounding Silver Hollow exchanged their heavy blankets of snow for ribbons of melting streams glimmering beneath early spring sunlight. Life resumed its familiar rhythms. Ranchers repaired fences weathered by cold winds. Children rode bicycles through quiet neighborhoods after school. The diner filled each morning with the scent of coffee and cinnamon toast, while conversations drifted easily between weather forecasts and local baseball scores. Yet beneath the ordinary pulse of daily life, something meaningful had changed. Stories once shaped by uncertainty had found their proper place within the hearts of those who carried them forward. Jack Sullivan stood near the overlook above the valley on a clear Saturday morning, hands tucked into the pockets of his faded denim jacket, while Ranger sat faithfully beside him. The German shepherd's black and tan coat shimmered beneath golden sunlight as he surveyed the mountains stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Below them, members of the Cedar Ridge community gathered near a newly placed memorial stone overlooking the northern ridge. Emily Carter Dawson stood among them, holding Benjamin's photograph carefully against her chest. Beside the image rested Thomas Whitaker's journal enclosed within a protective display case provided by the Historical Society. Harold Bishop adjusted the brim of his cap, while Evelyn Price greeted arriving families with gentle smiles. There were no television cameras, no reporters searching for dramatic headlines, only neighbors choosing to remember correctly. Children wandered between folding chairs carrying wildflowers gathered from nearby fields. Elderly couples shared stories long tucked away beneath the weight of passing decades. Jack remained slightly apart from the crowd at first, content to observe the quiet beauty unfolding before him. Ranger leaned gently against his leg, grounding him with familiar warmth. Eventually, Emily approached, carrying Benjamin's silver harmonica, discovered among the cedar chest's preserved belongings. "He would have liked you," she said softly. "Both of you." Her hand brushed affectionately across Ranger's shoulders. The German shepherd accepted the gesture with calm dignity before resting beside her feet. Emily looked toward the mountains. "For years, I thought peace meant finally knowing exactly how everything ended," she admitted. "Now I think peace means understanding that love stayed longer than fear did." Jack considered her words while spring breezes moved softly through the gathering. He had arrived in Cedar Ridge searching for little more than solitude after years defined by service and sacrifice. Instead, a faithful dog refusing to enter a forgotten tunnel had guided him toward people whose lives remained shaped by unanswered questions. Somewhere along that journey, healing had quietly found its way into his own guarded heart as well. The memorial ceremony itself lasted only a few minutes. Thomas Whitaker's name was spoken not with suspicion but gratitude. Benjamin Carter was remembered through laughter as neighbors recalled stories shared by Emily about county fairs, borrowed flashlights, and dreams larger than mountain valleys. When the gathering ended, families lingered beneath the sunlight, reluctant to rush away from one another. Ranger greeted children patiently while accepting scratches behind his ears from grateful hands. Later that evening, Jack and Ranger returned to the ridge behind the farmhouse, where distant peaks glowed amber beneath the setting sun. Wild grasses swayed gently around them while the first stars emerged overhead. Jack lowered himself onto the familiar wooden bench overlooking the valley. Ranger settled beside him, pressing close enough for shared warmth against the cooling air. Neither man nor dog spoke the language of certainty. Mountains still held mysteries. People still misunderstood one another. Loss would always remain part of loving deeply. Yet Jack had learned that kindness often outlived confusion if given enough time and courage to be rediscovered. Ranger lifted his head toward the horizon before resting it quietly across Jack's knee. The veteran smiled and scratched gently behind the German shepherd's ears. Far below, lights flickered awake throughout Cedar Ridge, while distant church bells drifted upward through the evening air. No metallic echoes followed. No hidden voices called from forgotten tunnels. Silence itself had become peaceful at last. Jack closed his eyes briefly and listened to the wind moving through pine trees beneath a darkening sky. Sometimes the world asks people to solve impossible mysteries. Sometimes it simply asks them to stay beside one another long enough for compassion to reveal what fear could never understand. And somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond memory, beyond all the stories still waiting to be told, kindness continued its patient work, returning home in ways no one could ever predict.